people object to that.
So all this is happening now. Shannon Breen, Bill Hemmer, brand new Hour of America's Newsroom, a lot to keep track of. We know the family is talking in Libya, and the father was saying the son was in Libya about a month and a half ago, so we'll work that into our coverage as well throughout the morning here.
We will. We want to take it now to senior foreign affairs correspondent Greg Palcott. He is live in Manchester, England with the very latest. So what do we now know more about this investigation, Greg?
Hi, Shannon, Bill. I was listening in on that press conference as you were and our viewers were as well. I think the key point coming out of that is we are investigating a network. We are looking into a network. That is the people supporting this guy. He was bad enough. He hit those young girls, those teenagers, those people at the arena at that concert Monday night, the arena just behind us right now. But there were other people helping, and that is what they are going for. Today, there were more raids. There were 3 arrests made in the southern side of this city. People connected, the police say, to this attack, as well as another raid near one of the train stations. Again, officials now saying that he did have help. This is a terror threat level, and the UK has now been raised to its highest, to critical. It hasn't been there for 10 years. That means troops deployed on the streets of the UK in critical locations like Buckingham Palace and number 10 Downing Street, the home of the Prime Minister, as well as big events like there's a big football game coming up this weekend in London. And we're learning more about the suspect, the dead suspect, the person responsible for that horrible bombing. His name, 22-year-old Salman Abedi, British-born of Libyan refugee parents, a conservative Muslim family, it is said, but it is also said that at least in the past year he had been radicalized, this according to various reports, and had contact with extremists in the area and was on the police radar, even went back to Libya and returned from Libya just about a week ago. Other unconfirmed reports that he had spent time in Syria and had direct contacts with ISIS. A lot of questions right now, Shannon.
All right. Greg, also, are we getting more information about the victims?
Sadly, and this is what makes this terror attack different than just about any that we've covered across Europe in the past couple of years, a horrible casualty toll. The latest, 22 dead, 64 injured. That's a new figure. 64 now in hospitals, 8 hospitals around this area. 20 remain in critical condition. Remember, it's a couple days. They're still fighting for their lives. Sadly, several of them young people, children. Again, the victims are in these hospitals, and they're not just children. They are people in their 20s, 30s, 40s, parents, we learn, who were waiting for their kids to come out of this Ariana Grande concert on Monday night. We're waiting to pick them up. We learn at least 2 sets of parents killed. The children survive. What a horrible ending to that concert. We are getting identifications of the victims, too. We're up to about 12 now of the 22 who were killed. And again, it tells the tale. There's an 8-year-old, there's a 5-year-old, there's a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, an 18-year-old, but also folks in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s. This horrible attack which caused havoc at the end of that concert and absolute terror outside of the arena that Monday night is just continuing to unfold, and the people here in Manchester continuing to grieve this horrible loss as we've just been listening, the police, the authorities here are doing their best to come to the bottom of it. Back to you.
And to hear about those victims, just a reminder, we should never become so callous that this just seems commonplace, these attacks. Greg Palcott live for us overseas. Thank you.
Stay tuned for more on that. Meanwhile, here at home, there are top officials in the Trump team now on the Hill defending the budget plan. That's Budget Director Mick Mulvaney testifying before a House committee at this moment. Mike Emanuel is listening. He's live from the Hill. And what is his message in selling the budget plan so far? Mike, good morning.
Bill, good morning. Mick Mulvaney's making the case for some of the tough choices in this budget blueprint. He is getting credit from Republicans for seeking to reduce deficits, eliminate deficits late in the next 10 years. Here's Mulvaney from moments ago.
And what we've been doing for too long, both parties, by the way, in this city have been taking money from people without laying out a plan for how we're ever going to pay it back. And we start doing that with this budget. This budget does balance within the 10-year window, something that is completely new in this town.
Democrats did not wait long yesterday before ripping this budget plan for tightening the belt on domestic spending.
This budget steals hundreds of billions of dollars from critical job-creating investments in infrastructure, education, and clean energy.
Would decimate health care options for rural Americans, children, seniors.
Harder for working families to get the health care they desperately need. Harder for families to put food on the table.
Passing a budget will be critical because that will be the vehicle to do tax reform with a simple majority vote in the Senate. Bill?
One other question. What are the expectations now on the cost of the health care proposal? Mike?
Well, we are awaiting the Congressional Budget Office analysis of both the cost and the impact of the Republican health care plan, a very critical number that lawmakers in both the House and Senate have been waiting on. House Speaker Paul Ryan talked yesterday about waiting on those numbers.
We just want to have an abundance of caution to make sure CBO scores have been unpredictable in cases in the past. We don't think that that's going to be the case. But again, we just want to make sure that we dot our I's and cross our T's exactly the right way so that when we send a bill over to the Senate, it is not, as we say, fatal.
Expectations are we'll hear from the Congressional Budget Office late this afternoon or perhaps this evening, and then we will get plenty of reaction based on their predictions. Phil.
Thank you, Mike. Good to have you there on the Hill. Mike Emanuel listening as we go through that hearing.
All right, joining us now for more on this, Fox News politics editor Chris Steigerwald. Good to see you, sir.
Howdy, ma'am.
Okay, I want to read to you a little bit from the Wall Street Journal because in a piece here, they talk about how the president's being just a little bit too optimistic. They talk about this 3% growth assumption that is being made to support this budget. The problem is the Trump administration has locked in its assumption at 3% growth despite having yet to release detailed plans for tax reform and other proposals. It goes on to say it assumes it's unrealistic growth to justify tax cuts, increased defense spending, and a promise not to touch Medicare or the retirement portion of Social Security, but it never explains how the administration's policies are actually going to get that done.
Yeah, well, there's that. Look, all presidents' budgets are dead on arrival on Capitol Hill.
That's true.
And it will be said a bunch of times, well, Donald Trump's budget never got passed. They could never pass his budget, nor would they pass anybody's. And, by the way, we should just say this as citizens, as mammals who live in this country, we should be happy that Democrats and Republicans are returning to the process of actually trying to have budgets, which is something that they didn't do for a long time.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, as you mentioned with the budgets, there were a couple of President Obama's last budgets that were voted down, something like 98-0 in the Senate. I mean, still members of both parties, these things come in and they say, yeah, that's cute, it's a framework. Now let us really write the budget.
Right, not governing documents, political documents. And this is a political document, not a governing document. This is a statement from the White House. These are the cuts we would make, and trying to make good on promises to the Republican base. Trying to make good on promises to Trump's voters to say, we are making the cuts, we are slashing these things. The problem ultimately in the end with Trump's new ideology for the Republican Party is it calls for more spending and more cuts. And it calls for a lot more and a lot less at the same time. And that's just not something that's easy to get through Congress. And they're going to have to come up with their own plan.
I've never seen somebody who loves budgets more than the current OMB director, Mick Mulvaney, who's a member of Congress. Right. He wanted that job, and he is so excited. And I think he enjoys going before the press corps into the briefing room like we saw him yesterday, sparring over this thing. He knows the minutia, the details of it. And when they pressed him on this idea of 3% growth, just saying, it's kind of crazy and ridiculous, it's just not realistic, he talked about how the previous budgets by the previous administration would rely on like 1.9% growth. He said that's pessimistic. By the way, while we're talking to you, we're seeing Air Force One with the president, First Lady touchdown in Brussels, where he's going to go on to NATO meetings, which that's a whole nother level of discussion of the potentially tense conversations he's going to have there. So we're watching as that comes in. Of course, we'll cover that as he disembarks from the plane as well. But in the meantime, Mulvaney is busy on the Hill defending his budget as they try to press forward. A lot of criticism over cuts. Of course, the left immediately says it's heartless, it's a no-starter, it's all good stuff for rich people and bad stuff for poor people.
Can I say one thing, sister, about the moment that you're watching right here with the plane landing in Brussels, which is, as this is the inverse and opposite moment for what President Trump experienced in Saudi Arabia. When he arrived in Saudi Arabia, they put his picture on the buildings, they cheered him in the streets. It's obviously an authoritarian state, but it was a place where they were super enthusiastic to see President Trump arrive. As he gets to Brussels today, This is a very different crowd. The leaders of NATO, just as he will face later on with the elite economies of the world, these are leaders who are very skeptical of him, who are very concerned about what his commitments are to NATO, to the West, to Europe. What role will America play? He's got a lot more hard work and a lot more diplomacy to do now than he did in the previous stops.
We know he said he's worried about their commitments. I mean, these people who are not paying 2% of the GDP, and apparently there's a plan for a lot of these countries, most of them who aren't paying it, to somehow get a plan together to show how they're going to start paying it by 2024, I think is the target year. He's criticized them for not doing well enough on terrorism, not being committed to that as well. But I do understand that one of the things he's going to do is to be part of a commitment of some type of 9/11 memorial, which is significant because, of course, NATO points to the fact that that's the time, one and only time that they actually marshaled all their defense forces to come to the aid of one of the members. So there's going to be a lot of conversation there that some of it may be uncomfortable.
Article 5, the commemorating triggering Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, is a big deal because this is a demonstration for Trump that, in fact, this is the best, most effective treaty organization in the history of the world. In the Westphalian state era of global politics, this is the best thing coming and going. And commemorating 9/11 and how NATO responded in Afghanistan, yes, obviously these countries aren't going to make the kind of military commitments that the United States can because we're the daggone United States. But their message to President Trump is pretty clear, which is, this is the best thing that we've got, as the West, as the Anglosphere, as all of these entities collected into one concept of sticking together and sticking up for one another. It's worked before, and they want him to know that it will work again.
You know I'm going to have to tweet out that quote for you today for Sarwalt. We're the daggone United States. In the meantime, Bill Hemmer's here, too.
Thank you, Chris. Stand on by there. One last word on Mick Mulvaney. What he's going to say as part of his message yesterday was, with regard to the budget, we're not going to measure our success by how much money we spend, but rather by how many people we actually help. He went on, we need folks to work. We need people to go to work. If you're on food stamps and you're able-bodied, we need you to go to work. There's a dignity to work and there's a necessity to work. So that's a lot of his message that he's taking to the Hill on that. While that debate continues here at home, let's reflect for a moment, Shannon, what we have seen so far. Just today, you had the presidents and the First Family with Pope Francis earlier today at the Vatican, where the president, upon leaving Vatican City, and have on any human being, and then a private meeting with Pope Francis. So that is now in his rearview mirror, while he has now visited Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, Jerusalem, and the Vatican on this singular trip. And as he goes into NATO, think about the context that he arrives in Brussels, Belgium now. He goes into a country that has been a hotbed of terror throughout Europe for the past 2 years, and perhaps you can make an argument even prior to that. But we know a year ago, March, when those terrorists went to the airport in Brussels, Belgium, and also the metro station at the same time and exploded their suicide bombs there on Belgian property. You also have November of 2015, the raid at Bataclan. Those killers came from Brussels, Belgium. There's a neighborhood on the western edge of Brussels, and that neighborhood has shown the willingness of this network in that country to travel to Syria and back again, to travel to Syria and get trained and get instruction and come back again. You have open borders throughout the continent of Europe. It is an issue. We do not know how they will resolve that. This president is well aware of that. And he goes trying to deliver a message of, just like he said to the Sunni leaders in Saudi Arabia, you've got to get a handle on this now.
And he talked about how we'll be a partner in that the U.S. will obviously join forces with those who are trying to drive out the terrorists. But as you said, Bill, he called on them saying,
at home, those two phrases are in quotes. Also, the president will not make a decision on Afghan troop levels for probably a couple of weeks, we are told. The U.S. wants NATO to formally join the ISIS coalition. That's an interesting encouragement from overseas on this trip. Some countries still are not totally on board, but thinks that they will come around. Not clear if that would happen during the president's visit. He said the Manchester attack will strengthen the resolve of NATO allies. That's Wes Barrett, our White House producer, on the road in Europe. Chris, that last point I think is very important for both of you to address. The Manchester attack and the resolve of NATO allies, and what is the impact of those events on this meeting today?
Well, our European allies, especially the Brits, have learned to deal with terrorism and had it be part of their lives in a way that Americans simply have not had to do. When you think about things coming full circle is that auditorium was built as part of an urban redevelopment project to cover over places where the IRA bombed in Manchester. The IRA trained its bombers in Libya. Now we see the same connections, but through a totally different course running through Manchester, England again. These are people who over the last 40 years have known radicalism of different flavors, of different styles in their communities. They have learned to live with it in a way that Americans never have had to do, and that's always part of the discussion.
Well, Colonel, I have about 15 seconds here before I think we'll lose the motorcade and we'll lose the window, too. Go ahead.
Well, the Manchester bombing was indeed a special event because if we needed more evidence, the fact that the terrorists purposely struck kids, tweens, teens, and their moms. I mean, that's as vicious as it can get. And the bottom line is that for all the military efforts we make, all the security efforts, the fundamental problem in Europe, and to a lesser extent here, is the law, our laws. Our laws protect terrorists. We need to update them to make sure they protect the innocent.
Thank you, Colonel. Thank you, Chris, as well there in Washington, D.C., as we see the motorcade go out of view. The NATO meeting gets underway shortly in Brussels. Shannon.
In the meantime, an urgent investigation underway in Britain. 4 people in custody, thousands of troops locking down that nation. We're going to talk to a member of the Homeland Security and Intelligence Committees, New York Congressman Peter King. Plus, we're learning about the bomber as detectives and intelligence services follow the twisted trail, what appears to be a cold-blooded killer.
Our priority, along with the police counter-terrorist network and our security partners, is to continue to establish whether he was acting alone or working as part of a wider network.
We're not going to second guess our British cousins, but the fact is there seems to be a broader circle of individuals of interest. An attack is this successful, it's almost always a group of individuals, a network, and a person who's being trained outside of the country where the attack occurred.
So, Sebastian, last hour from the White House now. British authorities at the moment deeply concerned another attack could be imminent. That's the word from England. The possibility that the Manchester killer had accomplices, a major concern. 4 people in custody already. New York Congressman Peter King, Republican, House Homeland Security Committee and Intelligence Committee as well. And, sir, good morning to you. I got a lot to go through right now. I think the word from Manchester police 30 minutes ago is significant. This is a network. That was the word they had to come out earlier, that came out rather a bit earlier today. Can you help illuminate what these British authorities are dealing with now, 36 hours later?
Yeah, I don't believe they would have used the word network unless they were pretty sure there were others involved. I think this comes from, at the very least, the sophistication of the weapon that was used. It appears to be the type of weapon that one person, unless he was very, very skilled, would have had great difficulty in putting together. So at the very least, that is reasons to think there's others involved. But also, they may have any type of eavesdropping, any type of surveillance, which indicates there's others involved in this. So the fact that they use the word network is significant. And also, they have other intelligence. I'm sure they're going through it all right now. They're scrubbing it all and finding leads to other people in that area who may have been involved.
Okay, now the French are reporting he went to Syria. That has not been confirmed by the British authorities, and Sebastian Gorka would not confirm that either. However, a month and a half ago, he did go to Libya.
Right.
Did he visit family, or did he go to a terrorist training camp that some we know were hit several months ago when President Obama was leaving office in January?
Yeah, again, all that has to be examined. And the fact, again, that's one of the real worries we have. There's so much travel back and forth between people in Europe to Libya, to Syria, to the Middle East. And we know that Libya has become a hotbed now for terrorism since the fall of Gaddafi. Again, Islamists are very powerful in Libya, and that is a main threat to Europe. But again, this back and forth between Europe and again, countries like Syria and Libya is very, very troublesome. Also, the fact that, again, he comes from a visa waiver country, so he could have flown to the United States and again, without having to apply for a visa. So these are real, again, it adds to the magnitude of the overall issue, Bill. It is facing the Brits right now, but it also faces us every day, and we have to accept that.
Rob O'Neill, last hour, Shannon said this about lone wolves.
It's not going to be the bomb maker that blows himself up. That's a skill that they have. They're not going to blow it up. They're going to give it to one of the mules who can carry it out, someone that wants to be a martyr that thinks he's going to go to paradise. But to say that a lone wolf doesn't exist.
Is he right about that?
I would say he is, yeah. I mean, first, he's almost right on everything. But he's, again, that wasn't a suicide bomber, though. Again, he was in there. He was involved in the shootout there. So put together a weapon of this.
Clarification noted. Keep going.
Sorry. In that, I agree, though, that if you're going to have something this sophisticated put together, you're probably not going to have the person lose his life because you need that skill. But as far as lone wolves, no, there are lone wolves because they can get radicalized over the internet. They can, again, these can be people, as President Trump said, are losers. So that is one element of it, the lone wolf. But to me, I'm as concerned about the lone wolf, but also about people who are part of a network, a loose network, people who have actually trained in the Middle East. So there's different levels of threats we face. They're all Islamists one way or another.
Last question. The president's now going to meet with NATO leaders in the context of Manchester. What is his message?
I think it's important that the Europeans, again, for the most part, they do cooperate. You know, the Brits are very good. But it's for them to realize this is a all-out effort. Some of the other countries for a while thought the U.S. had overreacted to 9/11, that we were going too far, and they didn't always cooperate with us, for instance, on airline fly lists, that type of thing. I think it's important that we stand together and that we, again, realize this threat is there. We can't be politically correct. We have to acknowledge and say that the threat comes from Islamist terrorism.
These European countries have been exposed to it in a significant way over the past 2.5 years. Sir, thank you for your time, okay? Peter King, the Republican from New York, there on the Hill. Thanks. Shannon.
Meanwhile, Tucker Carlson with a message to U.S. leaders in the middle of a terror investigation.
Well, you've seen this before, and you know what's going to happen next. Unfortunately, our leaders are going to tell us that acts of terror is something that happens, like the weather. Just accept it and move on.
So what can our nation learn from yet another horrific ISIS attack? At least they're claiming responsibility. A fair and balanced debate next.
If you really cared about America, you wouldn't want it to become Europe. Dangerous, divided, unstable. You wouldn't import a massive Muslim minority into your country simply because they made you feel open-minded and virtuous, and then hope for the best. That's a faith-based approach, and it's nuts.
Tucker Carlson talking about the growing threat of terrorism following that deadly bombing in Manchester. Carlson tackling the topic of the president's travel ban on his show last night, warning U.S. lawmakers against embracing multiculturalism at the expense of security. Can we do both? Richard Fowler is a radio talk show host. Katie Pavlich is an editor for townhall.com. Both are Fox News contributors. Great to see you this morning.
Good to be here.
Richard, what do you make of those remarks, of those warnings from Tucker?
Well, here's the thing. Don't get me wrong. I think we do have a problem with terrorism, right? We have a problem with ISIS. We have a problem with self-radicalization. But we don't solve that problem with a clenched fist. We solve that problem with an open hand. If we want moderate Muslims across this globe to stand up and say terrorism is wrong and we want them out, as the president said earlier this week, then we have got to say we embrace Muslims, right? We don't embrace the radical groups. We don't embrace the terrorists, but we embrace Muslims because that's who we are as a country. We are a nation of immigrants. Right, that's why we have the Statue of Liberty when you're pulling into New York via ship, because that's who we are. And if we turn away from that, the terrorists would have won. And that's what we don't want to happen.
Okay, well, Katie, a lot of folks say that is what we're doing. The president gave a very specific speech this weekend, over the weekend in Saudi Arabia, about the words that are used to describe the people. We're not at war with those of the Muslim faith at all, but he's saying the extremist elements within them that wish to do all of us harms, including fellow Muslims, they don't think are devout enough. I mean, It sounds like he's trying to send a very clear message that is along the lines of what Richard just spelled out.
Well, the first thing is Europe has outreached with an open hand for far too long, and they've embraced multiculturalism without the expectation of assimilation, which is why Europe is now crawling with terrorists and why the U.S. State Department has issued a travel warning to Americans going to Europe this summer. In terms of the president, Richard is right. We have embraced Muslims as a faith, and President Trump who very specifically tailored his travel ban to not Muslim countries, but to failed state countries like Libya, where this suicide bomber apparently visited before the attack, and he was criticized for it. So you can't have it both ways. You either allow the United States, in the matter of security, to tailor travel bans to look at where this terrorism is coming from without accusing the people who are doing it of racism or xenophobia, or you can take some responsibility for letting everybody come in and not doing a good job of vetting those people who then do turn to terrorism and kill Western people enjoying their Western values.
Well, and the travel ban obviously tied up in court right now. This is the second version. It dropped a rock from those countries that were part of the freeze. But again, those countries were chosen and identified as troublesome under the Obama administration. It's always important to note that. Now, I want to play a little bit of what we've gotten some sound from former Defense Secretary and former CIA Director Robert Gates talking about this and talking about the West.
Sadly, Manchester may be a harbinger of more such activities in the West as people leave, scurry away from those sites, and that doesn't mean they're defeated individually or that they've lost their commitment to attacking the Crusaders or whatever they want to call them. It just means they'll change their tactics.
And Richard, we've heard this talk of crusaders, or those who are viewed as opponents of the radical Islamic elements, to go after them, soft targets, concerts, malls, all those kinds of places. So how do we thread that needle that you and Katie have been sparring about here a little bit, making sure that we keep this country safe, we properly vet people, but we allow those in with open arms who are good people and would help us in this fight?
I think that's a good point, right, Shannon? So a couple weeks ago, I got a chance to visit a high school in Dearborn, Michigan, where a majority of the population there is of the Muslim faith. And they would tell you they're from places like Syria, they're from Libya, they're from Lebanon, and they will tell you that they're not terrorists. They're just people who want to come to America and live the American dream. So when you put in something, this travel ban the president puts in, and you block those individuals from coming in because you're trying to stop the one or two crazy people, or losers as Donald Trump would call them, you defeat the purpose. And you lead to more self-radicalization because they feel as though the developed world is saying we hate all Muslims. Not that that's not true. That's how they feel. So what we have got to do is we've got to sort of thread this needle, and how we do it is by opening our hands to Muslims and saying, and we need your help to find out who these terrorists are, find out who's self-radicalizing, point them out to us, and let's work together to solve the problem.
Almost out of time, but based on the look on Katie's face, I got to give her a final quick word here.
Like, Americans have gone above and beyond in terms of tolerating the things that Richard is claiming that we don't open our arms to. A lot of this multiculturalism has been tolerated for a long time. It's not just about terrorism, but it's about embracing cultural norms of Western countries, which we haven't been seeing in Muslim communities in Europe. And we've done a better job of it here at home, but we also saw just recently the first female genital mutilation case coming out of Michigan, which is about that community as well. And so I think that to say Americans need to do more is offensive, considering how much they've done already to embrace this type of culture.
We got to leave it there, because there's no way we're solving this in 2 minutes and 30 seconds. But Richard and Katie, good to see you both.
Good to see you.
Thanks.
So now we're learning the host of the Late Show, Stephen Colbert, in the hot seat after refusing to apologize for that joke about President Trump. He did address it. Now we know how the FCC is handling that incident. We'll tell you about that in a moment.
Condolences. I was glad to hear him say we're calling them losers now, because we've heard him over and over say, you're going to get tired of winning. We're going to be a nation of winners. And he is saying the opposite of that is a loser, and that is someone that would want to do this to families and to children.
They don't view it that way. Meanwhile, the president is getting a lot of attention on his overseas trip, not only by what he says, but how he's being received.
President Trump just met with Palestinian leader Abbas.
Yep, this after the speech in Saudi Arabia, where he called on Muslim leaders to purge countries of the wicked ideology of terror.
And John Huddy is live in Jerusalem. He lives in that area, knows it very well, and has the latest for you and your family. Good morning, John.
Well, good morning, Ainsley, Stephen, Brian. That's right. President Trump met with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas earlier in Bethlehem in the West Bank at the Palestinian Authority's presidential palace there. Both leaders condemning the attack in Manchester, expressing support and condolences to those, the families of those who were killed and injured, and also saying that they're willing to work together in fighting terrorism regionally and also throughout the Middle East. Now, President Trump, as you just mentioned, Ainsley, called those who were murdered in this attack, quote unquote, or the people that carried this out, or the person that carried it out, evil losers, not only this attack, but throughout the Middle East and all terrorism. He also went on to say that our society can have no tolerance for this bloodshed and slaughter of innocent people, including children. Now, both leaders then transitioned after expressing their support and solidarity into their discussions in particular, and we heard this yesterday, we're hearing it again today, about bringing both sides, the Israelis and Palestinians, back to the table to restart peace talks. Today, President Trump said, and really kind of summed it up by saying, if Israelis and Palestinians can make peace, that will begin the process of peace throughout the Middle East. It's something that he said in Saudi Arabia in his speech to Muslim leaders. It's something he said yesterday with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli President Reuven Rivlin. Now, Mahmoud Abbas said that, again, he's willing to fight terror, to work with the Trump administration on a peace process, and he said reasserting a two-state solution going back to the border of 1967, the pre-67 borders here in Jerusalem, with East Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine. That's something that the president didn't mention specifically in his remarks with Abbas. He didn't talk about a two-state solution or East Jerusalem as a Palestinian capital. Perhaps that will be mentioned or talked about when the president gives a speech today at the Israel Museum. And just to give you an idea of his schedule, right now he's at the King David Hotel. He's having some downtime, some free time. He'll go to the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial here in Jerusalem, lay a wreath, and then he'll be at the Israel Museum, which is just in the distance over my shoulder here, to give those comments and basically wrap up his trip here and the meetings that he's had on this historic visit.
Wow. Thanks a lot, Mr. Huddy, for getting us up to date on what's happening there. We'll go back to John shortly. Just to get an idea of how the president's being received overseas, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says, I want to tell you how much we appreciate the reassertion of American leadership in the Middle East.
Little shot.
He went on to say, for the first time in many years, I see real hope for change. Mahmoud Abbas said brilliant things about the president in Washington when he said maybe your negotiating skills can bring peace to the region. Of course, they have different demands. We know the hurdles, but they start off from a place of mutual respect. And lastly, I'll add this. King Salman said after the president left, he says Donald Trump's visit to the Muslim kingdom in the Gulf is a turning point in relations between the two countries.
That's terrific. You know, and when he used the word reassertion, that's just a little zinger at Barack Obama, who, for the most part, did not do much of anything. It'll be interesting to see what happens at the conclusion of the activities today, whether or not they have some sort of announcement, because we're not expecting a great big deal. But, you know, I think everybody thinks there's going to be an incremental change towards something where they can get together, both the Israelis and the Palestinians, on something, some little things, put them in the right direction, leads to something eventually.
John Huddy was holding up the Jerusalem Post this morning. I was watching earlier on the show, and he had a picture of President Trump, and he was touching the Western Wall, where he was putting prayers in the wall. And the headline said, it's a tough deal, but we will get there. So it's refreshing to see him with Benjamin Netanyahu. They greeted him when he got off the airplane, and they're saying, we love you, we support you. And then you also had banners up when he was going.
Well, we know who it was. You know, it was Islamists. President Trump called them out in Riyadh. He called them out again this morning from Israel. And I think what we need to do is look for action from the states that have been causing a lot of the problems. You know, he was standing next to Mahmoud Abbas, and Brian mentioned earlier, the Palestinians pay the families of suicide bombers for the rest of their lives for the damage, for the terrorism they've done against Israelis. If the Palestinians want peace, they need to stop that immediately. So I think there were calls to the Palestinians and to other Muslim leaders to join us in driving extremism out. Well, that starts at home, and some of those leaders need to be the ones stopping their support for terrorism.
Jim, is it telling, because they haven't released the individual's name that's responsible for this, is it telling that they are looking at maybe a group and there's more than one person involved? Because we don't have many more details when it comes to the identity of who this person is.
You know, I hope so. That would be fantastic if that's the reason. I believe they do know who it is, so the fact that they haven't released it, the British are generally a little slow about that, just to be deliberate. What I would like to hear is for Prime Minister May to come out and say, I have authorized our security forces to round up the 100 or 1,000 top people on their watch lists, because they have people they've already identified as extremists. They should grab every one of them, bring them in for some serious questioning, and try to see if they're connected to this, or if they can find out they might be connected to something coming down the pike.
It couldn't be too tough to figure out who could be the bomb maker in Manchester, England. You wouldn't think, although the EU, it's easy to travel betwixt the countries, because the level of sophistication of this kind of bomb is much different than just some guy with a knife.
Yeah, I mean, it takes the ability to build some sort of improvised device or potentially to smuggle one in. I mean, the smuggling routes in and out of Europe are pretty serious, so I think they could have brought it in that way. It could have been made locally. But the bottom line is somebody did it. That somebody is connected to other somebodies. Yeah. And terrorism expert Patrick Poole coined the term known wolves, not lone wolves. These people are known.